All right.
I didn't make it up.
Yeah. All right. 1 second. We're gonna record. Three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I just love true stories. I love history. I think we can learn something from every event. And this book that we're talking about today is called Bread and Roses: Mills, Migrants, and the Struggle for the American Dream. I love the phrase, the American Dream, because that's what this podcast is all about. So it is an honor to have you here, Bruce Watson, the author of this book. Great to be here,
Thank
man.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book. What was the cause for you to basically dissect this event?
Okay. It's not as well known as many other strikes in American history, which is surprising because it deserves to be. Just a staggering story. I felt very privileged to write it. It should be a movie, if Hollywood is listening. I taught school. I was a school teacher for many years, elementary, and one year I taught in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence, Massachusetts is a little bit about half hour, 40 minutes north of Boston. It's a mill town extraordinaire. It was the biggest mill town in America until the 1920s. And these mills, I'm from the West Coast. I'd never seen anything like it. These mills go on, they're 5 stories tall. If you've never seen a New England mill or in the South, they go on for a block or two or three. The mills are still there, although most of them are closed or reconverted to condos or something like that. And so I had seen this as part of many of my students came from there, from that area, from the town, and I'd drive through and look at it and just be wonder about the history. And then I started to hear about this strike called the Bread and Roses strike. And many people have heard the phrase bread and roses, not sure where it comes from. They are not. And so I looked into it and I discovered when I was looking for a book to write, it was a staggering story that had never been done as a full book.
Wow. So it and guys, if you're not familiar with this, just pull it up on Amazon. This book came out in 2006, 90 reviews on Amazon. It's very good. And I'm going to give you a quick little rundown. On January 12th, 1912, an army of textile workers stormed out of the mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, commencing what has since become known as the Bread and Roses strike. I've never heard of this until we started to research your book. Based on newspaper accounts, magazine reportage, and oral histories, Watson recounts Dickinson drama involving Dickinson. I think that's how you say that.
Based
Dickinson.
on Dickens.
Yeah, there we go. A drama involved thousands of parading strikers from 51 nations, unforgettable acts of cruelty, and even a protracted murder trial that tested the boundaries of free speech. So I just interviewed an individual today about meat packers strikes and all the unionization that was taking place and all the chaos that happened in Chicago. You're telling me, I mean, by the way, 1912, 1913, an unbelievable time in American history. So much was going on, and it seems like there was chaos in Massachusetts.
Well, there was a lot of chaos, especially at that. In most labor strikes in those days were pretty very violent. This one was not as violent as some, although there were two or three people killed and a lot of rocks thrown and destruction. It was far worse in places like Homestead or Ludlow, but this was sort of kept under a little bit by the people who came to town. We'll talk about them later. But yeah, it was a class war. There's no other way to say it. The nation was deeply divided economically and politically. Something like 1% of the nation owned half of all capital, all wages, all assets. And there were mansions that grew out of the Gilded Age in Newport and also just across the river in Andover, Massachusetts. There were mansions and there were tenements. And the tenements of Lawrence were as fetid and as crowded and as disease ridden as any tenements in the world at that time. And this is where the workers came from. And this really was what the strike was about. It was just about 32 cents a week. That's what they got their pay cut when the Massachusetts legislature cut hours from 56 a week, 56 hours a week to 54, just 54. They got 2 hour pay cut, work cut. They didn't have to work as much, but the pay was cut too, and they walked out.
Wow. Over 32 cents, which means you got to commend somebody to stand your ground. It's like the Revolutionary War. hey, enough is enough, and we're not taking any more. Let's fight for this. And that was the little spark that lit the fuse, basically, right?
Yeah. They called it the strike for 4 loaves because in those days, 32 cents would buy 4 loaves of bread. It's, of course, nothing like now, but still, most of the workers, I found this one of the most amazing American stories that I'd ever come across because it's American in a truly cosmopolitan way. There were strikers from 51 different nations, 51 nations living in Lawrence. A large contingent was Italians, a large contingent was Poles, French Canadians, but also Syrians, Greeks, Serbians. They had all come to Massachusetts, mostly at that time, come to Ellis Island. But the word there was go to Lawrence, get a job. These mills were just thriving in people. They needed so much labor. And so 51 different nations had to get together and get along and not go at each other and not break the strike in order for it to succeed. And that's what I found most inspiring.
Well, now, was this just something that spilled over from seeing the meat packers strike and maybe even the steel industry? I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I think that my heart always goes towards what happened here, and
Sure.
there was a lot of back and forth between the owners and the workers. So, do you think it was just kind of spilling across the United States. And so they saw what individuals or unions were doing and kind of saying, wow, if they're doing it, I have the courage to do it here also.
There might have been some of that, but I think it was a little different. First of all, they all knew the labor movement was really pretty much on the upstart then. This is 1912. Most of the things we later associate with labor, including successful strikes, minimum wage, strikes for minimum wage, sit downs, that hadn't happened yet. This was still a time when the American Federation of Labor was mostly just organizing skilled labor, skilled workers. They would not take any blacks, no women. It was mostly a skilled workers group. So there really was no labor union for ordinary textile workers. So they didn't really see themselves as part of that union effort. In fact, there have been attempts to organize Lawrence in previous years, and they failed pretty much. They hadn't had a strike there in a decade or more. And so they didn't really expect this. Everybody, when it started, everybody thought, "Oh, this will be over in a day or two or a week, and everybody will go back to work." But it just went on and on. So
Yeah.
they really were a little bit on the fringes.
So the owners were kind of shocked at how they responded. And so it probably scared the hell out of them. But how long did it go on for?
It went on for 2 months in and a couple days in the absolute most frigid winter that you can imagine. They were marching in sub-zero temperatures in Massachusetts, often getting up at dawn, going out and forming the picket line. Women were very influential in the strike. They'd get up, they'd feed their children, they'd go out to the strike, they'd come back and feed their children, and they formed soup kitchens that, based on nationalities. They had 14 different languages speak soup kitchens, the Italian soup kitchen, the Polish soup kitchen, where you could eat because you weren't making any money and children were hungry. And so that type of solidarity was very interesting. And the owners did not believe that could happen. In the previous strikes, they would just say, well, if the Italians go on strike, we'll get the Poles to break the strike, or the other way around. And that did happen often, which is why strikes were short. But something happened early on in the strike that made a big difference.
Hmm. Something happened early on, you said?
Yes, I was. What happened was a gang of rough, tough, experienced, and extremely radical labor organizers, the industrial workers of the world, came to Lawrence. Now, the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, was way more radical than the AFL, but they were the only labor, and I'm not supporting the IWW, believe me, but they were the only people who would take on this strike, and because they were the ones who were trying to organize in the steel mills, in the lumber industry, et cetera, where there were no unions. And so they brought their organizers to Lawrence. One of them spoke 5 different languages, was all over Lawrence talking about the need to stay on the picket line, et cetera. And that really it tamped some of the early violence down. Within a few days, strikers were parading through the streets behind an American flag, They really wanted to be seen as patriotic, and they were. This was not an anti-American strike. It was a pro-American strike. They just wanted their 32 cents a week. And the IWW would tell them radical things like, you deserve to own the mills, you deserve to have, much more. And they'd say, forget that. We just want the 32 cents a week.
That was it. It wasn't over anything except that, right?
It was really,
You're taking it away.
there were people in every nationality. There were a lot of people joined the IWW and cost like a nickel or something like that. But after the strike, they left the IWW and went back to work. There were certainly people who were in every nationality who were of that political persuasion, but most people, as I say, they wanted the American dream. They wanted the money back. They wanted to be able to send their kids to school. They didn't want their wives to have to go to work or their children, because children as young as 14, which was the legal limit in Massachusetts, were working in the mills. And some, if they lied about their age and the family needed the money, they were working too, 54 hours a week. It was extremely grueling.
Hmm. And obviously, this is going on at the same time, I believe. So the Bolshevik Revolution and what's going on in Russia, I'm sure all of this is all kind of intertwined, right? Where you're talking about the aristocrats versus the proletariats. Do
And
you
this
think
was a
that's
few
playing any factor in this?
this was a few years before that. Some of the people who were in the IWW they didn't call themselves communists, but they became communists, and they died in Russia. Bill Haywood, who was one of the leaders of the strike, died in Russia. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, another one. No, there's no doubting that. But it didn't play, and that was sort of their philosophy. But as I say, that wasn't the philosophy of the whole strike. And that was several years later. This is 1912, and the Bolshevik Revolution 5 years later. But the stirrings were there.
Yeah.
The certainly more influential than communism at that time in political American politics was anarchism. And that's a whole different story. And I wrote a book about Sacco and Vanzetti, if you want to talk about anarchism. But there were very few anarchists and very few communists in Lawrence. As I say, they didn't parade behind the American flag as a false flag or something to just as show. They were devout believers in the American dream.
So what caused the decrease in pay? Is that outlined at all of why they even made this move in the first place?
Well, first of all, the pay was not much. They you could hardly support a family, and as I said, you needed to have your wife and your teenage children go to work in the mills to support your family. It startled me to read that the average businessman or lawyer or mill foreman in Lawrence lived to be 50, 60 years old. The average mill worker died at 39. It was an extremely perilous job. There were they were breathing fumes all day and fibers. There were 2 or 3 accidents every week on their job. No supervision in that at all. And so this was, as much as anything, was they were just fed up. They were strung out. And so 32 cents a week seems like not much, but it was really the straw that broke the camel's back. And as I said, the 32 cents came from the fact that the Massachusetts legislature reduced the maximum hours of pay. It was a nice pro-labor move. They said you don't have to work. A few years before, they'd reduced it from 60 hours a week, maximum 60 hours a week, to 56. And at that time, everything was going pretty well, and there was no reduction in pay. But this time, it hadn't been a good year in the mills. And everybody thought, when we open our first paychecks, are we going to see a reduction in pay? They were ready. And sure enough, they were paid for 54 instead of 56. Many of them had flags and everything ready to go. They raced through the mills. They raced out into the snowy streets, and the strike was on.
Hmm. What do you think is the greatest takeaway from that? Is it stand your ground, or is it when you have to make a decision when enough is enough? Or was there anything that's a clear takeaway that maybe somebody who's out there who has a business listening could learn from this?
Well, I think it shows that people can only be pushed too far or so far, and that they're, especially if they have some degree of solidarity among their own nationality, but even more among workers in general, which is what really kept the strike together. Workers across nationalities, they are a force to be reckoned with. And one of the things that happened at the end, we'll talk later, I suppose, about how it ended, but when it ended and they win the strike, I hope I'm not giving a spoiler alert.
Yeah.
It was a remarkable story. We got a murder going on. We've got a children's exodus to talk about. We've got dynamite plot, all sorts of things. But when they won the strike, just before that, mill owners all over New England, and there were mills in most every town in New England, raised the pay of their workers without even being asked, without any strike. They said, we don't want another Lawrence in our town. And 300,000 people in New England, workers, got raises because of this one strike.
Hmm. Yeah. When you say even a protracted murder trial that tested the boundaries of free speech, what does that mean? What was happening with that?
The two guys who came from the IWW on the first days were Joseph Etter and Arturo Giovannitti, an Italian poet, and they spoke very eloquently, and they had the workers in the palm of their hand. As I said, they spoke different languages. They were all over. They're very convincing speakers. They kept people together. They were, as far as the mill owners were concerned, very, very dangerous men. And so 2 weeks into the strike, a woman was killed. There was a lot of violence, and police shot into a crowd, and a woman was killed, an Italian striker. Not even sure she was a striker, but she was on the side. And so now we got a murder on our hands, or at least a death. And very quickly, the powers that be in Lawrence landed on Giovannitti and Etter and arrested him. And they charged him with the murder. Now, everybody knew, and they knew, and the police knew. They weren't there. They weren't on the scene. But the question was, did their rhetoric, did their speeches inspire the violence? And that's what came up in the murder trial. That put Etter and Giovannitti in jail for the rest of the strike as martyrs, but also that they were gone. And that brought Big Bill Haywood to town to lead the strike, and he was a master strategist and veteran of many strikes. And so they sort of took the B guy out, and they brought in one of the most notorious labor leaders in America to lead the strike. But meanwhile, it would take until the strike was over for the murder trial to come and ask, can you be charged for murder for your words supposedly inspiring violence? I won't tell you how the trial comes out.
You're not going to tell us how the trial ends?
Well, if you want later, I will. But that,
Please, this is fascinating because I think free speech is under attack right now.
yes,
And you have individuals out there who say, well, there's a thing called hate speech.
yes,
And hate speech is a very general term right now, which means anybody, if they say certain things, can be charged with it. And I
yeah,
think it's scary for a democracy that in
yeah.
really a constitutional republic. But basically, it's scary for the American society that we
Yeah.
once knew and what we think we have. So where did it end?
Well, you can certainly there was no such term as hate speech at that time, but and they hadn't even passed laws about a clear Supreme Court, a clear and present danger, sort of inciting to riot. But there were laws against inciting to riot. Whether or not Etter and Giovannitti were guilty of that was a question in the trial, and it lasted several weeks. And the prosecution quoted many of their speeches, but the defense noted that 9 times out of 10, what they were saying from day one was, you must keep your hands in your. Etter particularly said, you must keep your hands in your pockets. You keep your hands in your pockets, the mill owners can't stick their hands there and rob you, et cetera, et cetera. You must not cause violence. If you cause violence, he had seen this happen in other strikes. If you cause any violence, it's going to backfire against you. They're going to it's an excuse to come in and lock everybody up. And so both of them really did not, their speech did not incite violence. And that there were no riots that anybody was, there were some breaking windows and things, but they were not guilty. They were found not guilty because
Ah,
they weren't guilty. They didn't, if they'd said, you go out there and, then they probably would have been guilty, but they were not. And they didn't take the jury long to acquit them.
oh, okay. Gotcha. All right. So yeah, so you see what's going on in society. There's so many parallels with what happened in 1912 as to what's happening now. I mean, history truly does repeat itself.
Mhm.
And it seems like you have written about many different subjects. And I do really want to, you bring it up. I wasn't going to bring it up, but anarchists, right? I don't think many people understand what true anarchy is absolute chaos. And so when I see people, especially conservatives like myself, people are like, "What are you, an anarchist? You totally against government whatsoever?" And I'm like, Well, you need government, you need roads, you need police officers. So you need certain things in place. You can't have true anarchy. But maybe I don't know exactly know what that definition means because I've heard many different definitions. But what
It
are
didn't
you referencing to whenever you talk about anarchy and anarchists?
it didn't play that much of a role in this strike, but it was a very prominent anarchism was a very prominent ism in that time. But it wasn't. You're right. Anarchy is generally considered to be chaos, no laws, just do whatever you want. That's not the philosophy of anarchism that some people in Lawrence believed. Anarchism was a philosophy that came out of Russia and Italy in particular, where governments were very, very oppressive. And the idea was kind of sweet, but I think horribly naive and stupid. And that was that if we can just do away with governments and do away, they didn't stop there, and do away with police and usually with churches, people will be nice. They will treat each other. They used to talk about, I know I'm laughing too. They used to talk about it was kind of nice and naive and innocent, but they used to talk about, well, what about a lifeboat? Some of the philosophers of anarchy would say, lifeboat, there's no government, but people get along. I'm not entirely sure they do. But that was the example. It was seen as something that would happen not right away, but over the years, if governments were done away with. And remember, these came out of Russia, Tsarist Russia, and Italy, not yet fascist, but otherwise Italy, where they'd never seen of the people, by the people, for the people. And these immigrants brought this over to the country, and it took hold, particularly in the Italian community. And that was the idea. I think it's just tragically naive, and but it was very dangerous at times because although many anarchists were very sweet and nice and they believe this, some anarchists believe in assassination. And they killed the president of the United States, William McKinley, an anarchist did that. And they killed the king of Italy, another anarchist who had lived in New Jersey, went back to Italy, killed the king. There were a couple other heads of state that were killed. And so anarchists were very much feared. They were the terrorists of 1912. Again, it didn't factor too much into this until the end when some anarchists, after the strike, some anarchists came to town and they paraded behind a banner that said, no God, no country. And that really led to Lawrence to crack down on the whole thing and throw the IWW out. But again, that's after the strike.
Wow. Okay. No God, no government. You want to get the attention of the media, especially in 1912. You talk about no God, right?
Yeah.
Very Christian, especially in Massachusetts, I
Oh,
think.
yeah. But before that, I think one thing that we were talking about how history repeats itself, but there was one thing that really didn't repeat itself in any American strike that is really the signature event of this strike. And that was what I call the children's exodus. It was mid-February. And this is why I think this should be a movie. It was mid-February, and the strike had been going on for a month, and it wasn't going well. They were out, but there were some mills running because of scab labor, people crossing the picket lines and stuff. And it was really locked down, really frozen, and it was dangerous, and the kids were hungry. And Bill Haywood heard from some strikers, and he went to New York and he talked to some labor people there, and they said, in Europe, some places they'll send the children out of town to get out of harm's way. And then they're not bothering their parents and saying, why can't we eat and stuff. So Haywood never been tried in America. He came back. They arranged, this was a massive effort. They worked with many of the women in women from the mills who were on strike, mothers, and they gathered about 200 children. They got permission slips for every one of them. They reached out to families in New York and in Barre, Vermont, where there were a lot of Italian marble cutters. And they arranged homes for each of these children. And one day they put them on trains with chaperones and they sent them out of Lawrence. Nobody had seen anything like this. And it was a very tearful situation. Mothers bidding goodbye to their children as young as 2 or 3 years old, not knowing when they'd see them again or if they would. But this was thought as a way to save the strike. And in a way it did, because the next time they tried it, the police thought this is making us look like we can't even care for our children. The next time they tried it, 2 weeks later, police came to the train station, they cracked down, they hit mothers, they separated children, they dragged them away, and the whole nation went up in arms. This was a national scandal, like children torn away from their mothers in Lawrence. And Congress soon held hearings about this because what's going on? And that was what made the mill owners decide to settle.
Man, they truly went all in to do this,
Yeah, this
right?
was,
Willing to give up your kids for this for
yeah.
32 cents.
I find
Yeah.
that very inspiring, and I loved doing this book. I loved finding every week I was discovering something new, something strange, something uh, surprising. That's why I talked about Dickens, because I didn't have to make this up. It was just like a novel that unfolded.
Yeah, that sounds like a movie. Now, here's where I stand, and maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but unions were amazing back in the early 1900s, right? You needed them,
Mhm.
especially in the steel industry, all the crazy situations they were put in, the bad working conditions. You have the Pinkertons going again. You're probably familiar with that story,
Oh,
where the Pinkertons against the workers. And so I think unions in the beginning were a great idea. As time went on, I think they became very powerful, but very corrupt, ultimately actually sinking the company, which actually hurts them, the people in the union. So, in my opinion, it turned out to be a bad thing the way it was used. But where do you stand on them?
well, we might disagree. I will not disagree with you at all about the corruption, especially the Teamsters in the 50s and 60s. On the other hand, it could be argued, and I appreciate that you praise unions work in the really from about 1900 through the New Deal to into the 30s. We wouldn't have minimum wage, or it would have been even slower coming. Child labor laws, um, occupational safety laws, collective bargaining, all of those things were earned by unions, and that's why they say you'll sometimes see bumper stickers saying the folks that brought you the weekend. That to me is what unions are.
Wait,
Beyond
didn't
that, of
Ford
course,
though? I thought Ford did that without unions. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
no, he raised his pay without unions. You're right. He raised his pay in 1914. There were certainly no unions at Ford in 1914. He did that so that his workers could afford to buy his cars, which is a brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
And but that didn't mean that they could. That was one example. Go across town to other car makers, and they were still slaving at it. Um, Minimum wage didn't come in for another 20 years. Same with child labor. It wasn't just unions, it was the New Deal and other things. But beyond that, we all know that in the 50s and 60s, unions were pretty corrupt. They were always, when I was a kid, there were strikes all the time, and they were always on coming before Congress for this or that. I don't think that's what Dale Haywood and Joseph Etter and the strikers of Lawrence had in mind, and they were probably a little naive about the goodness of union people versus the evil of the mill owners. However, it could also be argued, and I would, that the times that we often look back to is when America was great, when one guy could support a family by working at a Ford plant in the 50s and 60s. That was made by unions. That was made by that constant pressure to keep the wages from falling. Most of the strikes up until 1930, they weren't about healthcare benefits. They weren't about 40-hour weeks. They were about pay cuts. It wasn't just like this one, and only it was even more. They would just slash your pay with no recourse. And if you were just the idea of a union is that you have some power, you collectively have power that you individually do not. We see a resurgence of unions in our own time. Now they called last summer the summer of strikes, and I think it's gonna. I see it sort of as a force of almost a force of nature. When people are pushed to a certain level, they will only take so much and they will collectively go together, band together. And another force of nature is the notion that among the management is that we treat you well. We treat you very well. That's what the mill owners were saying in Lawrence. We don't listen to those guys. We're together. The management and labor are together. And so that force and that constant tension is just a part of the institution of labor all around the world. And I don't see it as evil. I don't see it as good or bad. I see it as inevitable. And I want people to have the American dream.
And I think that with technology and AI and everything that's coming down the pike, we're getting away from a labor intensive society,
Yes, we
right?
are.
So unions are losing power as time goes on, I think, right? And maybe I'm sensing what I just saw from Nippon Steel buying US Steel, right? You have a Japan company coming
Mhm.
in, buying up US Steel, which I can't believe, right? 1912, I think US Steel was the biggest company in the world at that time.
Mhm.
So you see a company like that that has fallen based off of Nippon doesn't have unions, and I don't think, I'm not sure, maybe they do, but certainly not the regulations that we have here. So it's amazing what has happened, but as time goes on, AI technology taking away these people's jobs. I don't know where that what happens to unions, and do they lose their power? Do they migrate somewhere else? What do you believe is going to happen?
I think they'll probably, I think as workers are threatened by anything, whether it's AI or, or job flight to other countries or whatever, they will respond. We've seen unions were drastically reduced after the 80s and 90s and way down. Union membership was down to 10, 5% in some industries. Only in the last couple of years has that come back, and you've seen people trying to organize at Amazon or the
Mm,
huge strike last summer in the auto industry. I can't predict for sure. Union representation is still a fraction of what it was in the 50s and 60s. It seems a little resurgent. What usually happens, and what happened in Lawrence for that matter, when the unions got stronger, is the companies said, "We're out of here." And they went to those mills were empty when I taught in Lawrence because they had left in the 30s because of the unions. And the companies, the textile unions, went south and they opened up in North Carolina and other places because there were no unions. And now you can go overseas and send your jobs overseas, and because there are no unions. And then so you ask yourself, well, what is the working person to do? If they want a decent wage, but if they can get a job cheaper overseas, if there's no union overseas, that's a problem they didn't face in Lawrence. Uh, I still think I still believe in American manufacturing, and I believe in unions, uh, despite some of the excesses. And that's for them to work out, though, not for me. I'm telling a story about 1912, which I hope will inspire people.
yeah. Guys, check out his book. I mean, you have many. I just want to reference a few other ones, but the one that really picked up steam, it seems like, is the Stephen Colbert book, right? Beyond Truthiness, and the Jon Stewart book, obviously making waves on Amazon. So why focus in on these two individuals? And before you answer, Jon Stewart to me is he's a middle of the road guy to a certain degree. Seems like he dances a little bit on the left, but sometimes makes fun of the left. And even with him and Colbert, it was funny how he was like, "Yeah, do you realize like the Wuhan lab created COVID vaccine?" And Colbert kind of like was trying to defend it, but he put it out there for the world to see. So they're a little bit different, and I see Jon Stewart resonate with a lot of people, but Colbert is definitely one-sided. So why these two guys?
Well, I wrote those several years ago when Stewart was still on the Daily Show. I know he's back, but and Colbert was on his own show, the one where he would wave the flag and pretend to be this wacky character. I just found them fascinating. I loved the show, the Daily Show. I didn't love the Colbert Show. I loved Stephen Colbert on the Daily Show before he got his own show. When he was this deadpan, brilliant mimic of
He was funny, and
he
John, I
was
mean,
so he was
yeah,
the
on there
best.
for sure.
And when
Yeah.
they were together, it was wonderful. So I got a chance to write these biographies, short biographies about each one because I was a frustrated satirist years ago. I would always write that in the high school and other newspapers, Mad Magazine, all of that. And this was a sort of an outgrowth of that. And so I wrote about each one and found them very different. But I got to watch all the old shows when you could used to be able to watch every single one on TV and mined that material to make books.
So you just research their life, anything fascinating that you could share with our audience, maybe it'll entice them to check out one of these books if they I don't see many of my audience members picking up a Stephen Colbert book, just so you know, but they may pick up Jon Stewart.
Well, they might. I think Stewart was. I'm surprised you think he's middle of the road. I think he's pretty on the left,
Or
but
I
the
would
way
say more left, but he does dance on the right every once in a while.
and he's not afraid to go after both sides. And he frequently criticized Obama. Just this last week, he had Joe Biden and showed some of his gaffes and made it fairly clear of his concerns. Stewart was interesting because he was I thought, a rather mediocre comedian, frankly, on his own stand up in the 90s. And then he got this gig to be on the Daily Show, and he just turned it around. And the timing was perfect, right around the start of 9/11 and then the Gulf War, and he just became this huge, huge figure. Colbert was more interesting. Colbert had his own 9/11. It was a tragedy in his family. His father and brother were killed on September 11th, not in the Twin Towers, but in a plane crash, and he grew up scarred by that, and really found his voice in comedy and improv. And I found them both highly intelligent and really thoughtful and just fun. And so I appreciate that kind of approach. I think I need a little fun in my daily life, especially when I look at politics.
Yeah, it seems like you're in this world. I think you write for The Attic. Is that right?
That's my online magazine, my own.
Okay.
And I've been doing that for 7 years now. And I call it A Kinder, Cooler America because I used to write for Smithsonian Magazine and they would send me all over the country. No politics, just go to a Wizard of Oz festival, go to write about Jack London, write about something else, and I love doing that. And lately, by 2016, I didn't work for them anymore. Had written books, but so much of our history has been politicized, one side or the other, people barking at each other and using it one way or another. And I hated that. I wanted to just write the stories that I wanted to write about a kinder, cooler America. So if you go to theattic.space, there's my plug, theattic.space, you'll find by now about 300 short articles about everything from E. E. Cummings, the poet, to Burning Man, to I went to the Cadillac Ranch in Texas. I went to Harper's Ferry. I went to Surf City in California, and I just do this on my own. I have a new article every week.
Oh, wow. Interesting. And I did want to ask you, I have no idea what it is. I didn't even click on it, but The Man Who Changed How Boys and Toys Were Made. Tell me a little bit about this book.
That was my first book, and it was came out of an article I wrote for Smithsonian about a man named A.C. Gilbert. Nobody knows that name anymore, but at one point he was a household name. He invented the erector set. He really actually figured out how to put it together. Your audience probably a little young to remember erector sets. I had one when I was 8, but that was the very end of erector sets back in the 60s. They were the premier boy toy in America from around 1915 to around 1960. And every boy had an erector set. And many, many future engineers and chemists and others were made by either a Gilbert erector set or a Gilbert chemistry set, a microscope, something else. He was a fascinating man because he created the educational toy industry in America. He reached out to boys and had all these contests and prizes and newsletters and everything, and it was fun to do. I wrote about erector sets, and that sort of led to everything else.
Wow. So AC Gilbert puts together the Erector set, and it's an educational game, basically to increase education within young men, young boys, and women, right?
Well, I deal with women. There weren't many girls who had erector sets. The ones who did, who I talked to, their fathers were engineers, and they wanted, and often they wanted a son and they didn't have a son, so they got their daughter an erector set. No, erector sets were not a game. They were little girders and about this wide. It was screws and nuts and motors, and you could build a bridge that would go up or down. You could build these fantastic things that were so tall as you, that would, if you had a big enough set.
The
Or you could build,
Sandlot. It's the Sandlot, if you've ever seen that movie, right? Where
yeah,
he
it's very
goes
much
in
like
and
that.
does, yep.
Yeah, and so they were a construction toy. They were one of the first construction toys.
Hmm. And so what anything fascinating? I just love understanding new entrepreneurs I've never heard about. So anything
But he
really
was
cool about how he made it or lost it or anything like that?
he was a brilliant entrepreneur. He had an MD from Yale, but he never practiced medicine. He became a magician, and he started by selling magic tricks to magicians. And he saw the erector set possibilities of the erector set, and then he began to market it. And either he or the people he hired were genius marketers. They reached out to boys with, as I say, all sorts of ads that spoke directly to boys. His phrase was, "Hello, boys, let's make lots of toys." And he promoted himself as a basically a grown-up boy. I can understand what you boys want because I was a boy myself and I did this or that. By the way, he was also the world pole vault champion at the 1908 Olympics. Just a amazing guy. And he traveled around, and he had a train car for a few years where they put in this, they attach it to the end of a train, and it was filled with his toys. And it would come to town, and they'd announce the Gilbert train car is coming to town. Boys would line up to go see all those toys. I mean, he really knew how to sell the product.
Wow, I got to look into this. I've never
Yeah,
heard of this guy. And of all your books, just so you know, this one stands out that I need to check out more than anything because I just love learning about somebody out there who potentially, changed the world through one game. And like you said, it created an industry almost.
created an industry, and it created, you would hardly find um, an engineer, or at that time, in the days when America really built things, boys could look out, and some girls could look at the railroad track, and or see the bridge and see how it was made and go home and build one. He also, by the way, Gilbert also owned American Flyer trains, which were, he didn't start it, but he bought it. And so he was totally a master of that type of recreating the world, building the world in your own living room.
Wow, American Flyer. My dad had those toys, and obviously he gave them to my
Probably
brother.
had an erector set too in Pittsburgh.
I bet my dad did have one.
Yeah, he
American
did.
Flyer though. Those trains, those are staples. I mean, my dad was born in 1950, so this is right in that prime time era.
Yep,
Man, this is interesting. I'm going to check out AC Gilbert, guys. If you're looking to understand an entrepreneur of how to make it, look up AC
absolutely.
Gilbert. And the book is called The Man Who Changed How Boys and Toys Were Made. He has many books out there, 7 or 8 I could just see right from this list. But Bruce Watson, I really appreciate your time, man.
Thank you.
And is there any book that really put you on this path for learning to read or write or like I always bring up Rich Dad Poor Dad as the one that set me on this path. So is there
Mhm.
anything like that for you?
I became interested in American history and telling the story of American history, um, partly through Ken Burns, but partly later in my life, like when I was in my 30s. I hated history in high school, and like many people. And I came back to, it's hard to remember any one book, almost any basic American history book that tells the truth. But not Howard Zinn, which is just one side of the truth, but or the other side, but something that goes straight down the middle. There were some by a guy named James McGregor Burns that were really the first histories that I just devoured. Also histories that are narrative, that tell a story like the ones I tried to write. There's one about the Dust Bowl called The Worst Hard Time. There's one about, well, there are just so many others. Reading about Lindbergh, and reading about World War II, or some of the Civil War stuff. Seeing, as I call it, a kinder, cooler America, that we've had these troubles all along. We've come through. That's the story I'm looking for in history.
Nice. And his website, guys, just to repeat, is theattic.space. Is that correct?
Right, that's right.
Bruce Watson, thanks so much, man. Really appreciate
Thank
your
you, Mike.
time.
Okay.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life.